George Washington, the leader of our nation. Quote to George Washington from Thomas Jefferson. Permit me to express here my felicitations, not to yourself, but to my country. Nobody who has tried both public and private life can doubt but that you are much happier on the banks of the Pottawatomie than you'll be at New York. But there was nobody so well qualified as yourself to put on our new machine into regular course of action. Nobody the authority of whose name could have so effectively crushed opposition at home and produced respect abroad. I am sensible of the immensity of the sacrifice on your part. Your measure of fame was full to the brim, and therefore you have nothing to gain. On February 4th, 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States under the Constitution. This would be a crucial turning point in American history as Washington became the first democratically elected president in our newly formed country. In his first term, Washington would set a foundation in his first 100 days for all future presidents. George Washington's leadership as the country's first president will determine the future direction of the United States of America to be a country that influences the world. Once George Washington got into his 20s, he was sent a lender by Buendia to join the French and Indian War. He was the one that instructed Washington when he got there. George Washington played a super important role in the beginning of the French and Indian War. George Washington joined the war in the late 1753. He was selected as a British emissary to the French frontier establishment. The war ended when Fort de Queen's collapsed from the British and colonial forces. During the fight, George Washington's ambitions helped determine the course of the war. His later actions as a leader were influenced by him being a leader in the French and Indian War. George Washington became a Virginia delegate. He worked to keep the Virginia delegate unified. George Washington and the rest of the Virginia delegates discussed things such as boycotting British goods to establish the rights of Americans or planning for a second Continental Congress. George Washington's role in this, though, goes a little deeper. George Washington was elected with the other Virginia delegates. He also offered lots of possibilities for all the other Virginia delegates to discuss. Here again, it's showing him being a leader, trying to hold all the Virginia delegates together. Getting close to the actual election, he was also the leader of the Continental Army. It was on June 15, 1775, he was assigned to lead the Continental Army. At the time, he had been working in the Virginia House of Burgesses. After accepting the invitation, he sent a message to his wife, Martha. In the letter, it talks about him saying nothing could separate them with lots of fancy words and refers to himself as a votary. He also says he hopes to be home by the fall and talks about how nervous he is for his new role. After the letter, he takes command of the badly trained or not even trained army he has on July 3, 1775. He leads his armies to amazing victories such as the Siege of Boston, April 19, 1775, or Battle of Long Island, and countless more. He managed to get the British Army to surrender in 1781 and won the war. After the war, they created the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation let the United States fight against the British. 3 years after the ratification of the Articles of Confederation, many Americans, including George Washington, began to argue that the perpetual Union was in danger. On January 18, 1784, Washington wrote to Virginia Governor Benjamin Harrison that the government was very weak and that it was barely standing on 2 legs. The national government's weakness led to serious problems that threatened the nation's survival. Moving forward to 1787, George Washington was politely persuaded to join the Constitutional Convention. He somehow ended up being elected president from the Constitutional Convention. The convention met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania from May 14th to September 17th. The people in the convention would mostly gather to discuss different problems that had come to be while the newly independent nation was operated under the Articles of Confederation following independence from Great Britain. Between December 15, 1788, and January 10, 1789, the presidential electors were chosen in each of the states. 10 states cast electoral votes: Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia. New York, though, wasn't able to select electors in time. Washington was the obvious choice for them. He He was a national hero and the son of Virginia, which was the biggest state at the time. Once the votes came, it showed that George Washington had the most electoral votes at 69 electoral votes. John Adams came in second with 34 electoral votes. This led to him being the first vice president of America. Moving on, we went to see what a president does in his first 100 days. Almost everyone determines how good or bad a president is in their first 100 days. One of the first things he did was write a letter to the House of Representatives on May 8, 1789. After that, he signed the first bill under the Constitution on June 1, 1789. This was a measure to regulate the administration of oaths. He did lots of other things in the first 100 days, including establishing the Department of Foreign Affairs on July 27, 1789, and establishing the Department of Treasury on September 1789, and more. In his second term, he did lots of amazing things, but there were a few important key things he did. He was elected in his second term on February 13, 1793. At a time during his second term, there were lots of tension between the cabinet. The cabinet members, of which there were only 4, included Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph. The tension in the cabinet was mostly between Jefferson and Hamilton. They would mostly complain about each other's mistakes and slowly become enemies. But somehow Washington brought these men to their senses and got them working on some good tasks that was worth working for. At the very end of his second term, lots of people were ready to elect him for his third term. George Washington went against this and said that you should not keep electing me and I might become something like a king. He also was saying that we did all this work to get away from a king ruling over us. So he set the precedent for future presidents to not go back for a third term. The first person to actually break this is FDR in the early 1900s. It was finally time for George Washington's farewell address. In the 7,641-word document, he talked about how American people should stay unified and resist the rise of political groups that wanted to divide the country and political groups that would bring in foreign powers such as the British. Now jumping ahead, we will see how George Washington's precedent was used by further presidents. One of the first things that people followed was only lasting as a president for 2 terms. The only president that broke this was FDR, and he ran up to 4 terms, but died not too long after in office in his 4th term. He felt the right to do this because of World War II and the Great Depression. Not until we made a constitutional amendment saying that presidents are not allowed to run for 2 terms. This is how important one of the parts he said. Another really important part of the precedent he said was the cabinet. I already have referred back to this a couple of times, but this just shows how good the system is and that we held on to it. At the time, they only had 4 people in the system. Now we have up to 16 people all doing different things for the president. Some of the roles are Department of State, Department of Defense, and Department of Agriculture, and many, many more. Finally, to end it off, I just want to say how much of an incredible, inspiring leader George Washington really is. He has done so many things for his country, starting from a tiny thing as being a leader in the French and Indian War and leading us to an amazing victory, and even becoming the first Democratic president of America, which is amazing. He set such a good precedent for presidents to follow that we still follow today. This just shows how important of a person he was in our history and how much an important turning point he really was in American history.